Hello there. Yesterday was the feast of St. Mary Magdalene. Yeah, this is from the Bible. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers, and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene, she was trying to cling on to him, and he said, "Do not hold on to me." She was like that, pouring perfume over him. He cast 7 demons out of her. I say all this because there is a modern fashion of saying that she wasn't a prostitute. But she was a prostitute. In fact, the name Magdalene means something like that. People want to be relieved of the spiritual path. It's all just a bit too much to be told that there's somewhere else. It's a bit too much to be told that you're going to die, or that you're full of sin, or that something needs to be changed. They spend a great deal of effort to try and say that everything is okay. The problem is that everything is okay, and being mortal is okay, just like the grasshoppers and the badgers and the snakes. There's no problem with being mortal. Everything is okay already. Sort of. The spirituality is not about making things okay. It's about evolution. It's about reaching for the stars. Yesterday I watched this movie from 1984 with Mel Gibson, The Bounty, which tells the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. Probably people in Britain will know what that story is about, but I'll explain it briefly to anybody else. Several hundred years ago, when Britain ruled the waves with their salesmanship, their maritime knowledge, and they had wooden boats. Several hundred years ago, one vessel called the Bounty set off from England to Tahiti, full of British sailors, and they were on an expedition to collect the breadfruit plant from Tahiti. And finally they managed to get to Tahiti. And this is a true story, by the way. It's a true story. Actually happened. And when they got to Tahiti, they got the usual welcome, which included a lot of half-naked and beautiful wild Tahitian ladies sleeping with all the sailors. And they stayed in Tahiti for several months. And when it was time to go, the sailors didn't want to go. Well, we can all understand that, can't we? They didn't want to go, and there is this scene in the movie which marked me. Finally, the Bounty is pulling away from Tahiti, and in order to do that, the captain of the ship, Captain Bligh, had to be quite nasty with the sailors, and 3 of them who had tried to escape are chained to the deck of the ship, and their backs are being whipped until the backs are lacerated with a lattice of flowing blood. And that's one half of the scene. And then in the water below the deck of this British vessel, in the water, is a flotilla to send them off from Tahiti. And the Tahitians are in wooden canoes, and they are wailing and crying as their companions and friends for the last few months are leaving them. And the lady Tahitians are, with shells, they are cutting into their scalp, and blood is flowing down over their foreheads. And so there's blood amongst the Tahitians, these primitive, childlike people who express themselves very instinctively. And then on the deck of the ship, you have these English who are using this method of control to whip people into shape and to set an example. And so there was blood in the water on both sides. So who's in the worst position, you know? This is where we live. This is the world we actually live in. It's frighteningly undeveloped. That's what people have to do in order to make their lives work. That's as far as human beings have got to. Not very far. If we go back to Mary Magdalene, as I said, there's this cottage industry today where people have decided that the last 2,000 years of Christianity is wrong. And I was reading this paper from a university about how Mary Magdalene wasn't a prostitute. And in the paper they quoted various references from the past, except they weren't quoted in such a way as you could really read them. They were only half quoted. And this type of concealment is quite typical of human beings. In the same way as they burn down libraries, if the libraries, for instance, show that people of the past were of a higher ilk. People don't like to be told that. For instance, I heard recently that in 1400 in the UK, it was typical to only have to work 160 days a year, and you have 200 days off a year. That was the average working life. 200 days off a year. And that even if you're a peasant in those days, if you're a peasant in England, you farm 30 acres, and you would have to pay 5% to the landlord. Only 5%. And you would have 30 acres per person. Those were the conditions in the evil Middle Ages. They seem pretty luxurious compared to today, don't they? And people don't like to hear about these kinds of things. They like to be told utopian stories that everything's going to be okay. And without blame, you've got to realize that a great deal of activity is exerted by human beings simply to bury uncomfortable truths. And on this planet, in this society, we have to do something quite incredible and quite difficult. Now, the other day I wanted to talk about the idea that work should be done for its own sake, which is something that I always appreciated. And as I've been quite active doing my round of maintenance this year, and I'm full of pluck, I'd like to talk about it. And I was doing a little washing up the other day in the morning, and I felt that I was really doing it for its own sake. There was something very nice about how I was approaching the task. I wasn't trying to be anywhere else, you know? And it seems to me that if you work for its own sake, what that phrase really means is that you are doing your being particle duty, and your centers are functioning correctly, and therefore you are nourished by it, and that the work is wholesome. It's wholesome for life. In other words, it gives something to life. It also gives something to you. And there is a feeding from life, an uncorruption, a lack of sin. And this has positive results for you and for life. And that's what it means if work is done for its own sake. In that phrase, it doesn't really describe the reciprocal feeding that occurs when you act in an uncorrupted way, you see? So it's actually not for its own sake, but for the sake of life and for you, for your soul, you see? But because of the level of confusion of human beings, you can not really say that you do things for yourself, because human beings have lost their soul, and it would be interpreted incorrectly. And so in this situation where human beings live in a false self, it's very difficult to really describe how to exist correctly. Because if you ever say to somebody that you should do it for yourself, they will almost always interpret it as meaning for their false self, because they don't know their soul. And in so many different ways, the society is reinforcing their sense that their false self is who they are. And their false self is this character that does not do being particle duty, that lives in distortions and corruptions, and therefore cannot feed properly, you see. And then following on from that, you have this terrible confusion about the contempt for the material world. Now, pagan people who have this sense that the material world or the physical world or the earth world is valuable, they rebel against this. They say this world has to be the world we live in. And that's correct. Because in society, when you hear people talk about the material world, they're talking about what the false self sees. Because the false self, everything that it sees is just nonsense.